With us today, we have Madam Geetha Gopi N, who's a rehabilitation psychologist and a consultant special educator. Madam Geetha is the Director of Professional Development and Programs at the Sashakti Trust, Cochin. She has over 30 years of experience in helping children with special needs. She's worked in international schools following an American curriculum for inclusive school settings primarily for more than 15 years. Madam Geetha has done extensive work in curriculum development and adaptations, behavioral management, coordinating and promoting the best educational practices using the UDL principles. She's also launched the Early Academic Series, which is a teacher's kit for teaching early English language skills and basic math based on the universal design of learning. It's a pleasure to have you with us, ma'am. The session is for 2 hours, is what I would like to inform you all. And once the speaker sharing starts, the chat settings would be switched to host and panelist. Wishing you all a very happy learning. Over to you, Madam Geetha.
Good evening to all the participants, and thank you, Ability, once again for giving me an opportunity to speak on such an important topic. So again, without wasting much time, I would really like to get into the topic for today. So let me go into the screen share. So today's topic is about how to go about developing a personalized intervention plan for children with special needs or having academic challenges. When we talk about planning an education program or an intervention plan for children with special needs, it has to be understood that it has a precursor. So the precursor is, I'm sure through the other workshops and webinars you may have attended from the Ability platform. You may have had insights into various kinds of academic challenges that are faced by children with special needs within the classroom, identification and assessment of various academic challenges, or even non-academic areas like social skills and the sensory motor and so on. And then once you assess, of course, I'm sure many of our webinars and workshops have focused on multimodality interventions to support children with academic challenges. So basically, identifying the challenges, assessing them, and then intervening and providing support services. So we've had a fairly good background through the Ability platform in all these areas. So now we are going to take it a step further on how do we actually plan a holistic educational program or an intervention program. So today's workshop will look at what is IEP or Individualized Educational Plan or Program. What is its importance? What are the different components that constitute an IEP? How do you go about developing one? What are the common challenges that most educators face when developing an IEP? And then last but not the least, I've given a kind of sample format. It's not a one set format, but a sample format, which will include all the things that a decent IEP needs to have. So let's try and understand what is this thing called IEP. What is Individualized Education Program? The IEP or Individualized Education Program is a written document. So it is a document, a written plan that is developed by a school's special education team or a center's special education team. It has with input from the parents so that you can support the children with special needs in the best manner possible. It actually specifically lists out the academic goals And when we say academic, it doesn't mean purely school academics. It could also be academic related goals, which need, like behaviors, social skills, study skills, and so on. So a student's goals and how the method, like how are you going to achieve these goals or targets. So that is another thing that is specified in the IEP. And it is required for every student, either with an identified or recognized disability, or maybe the disability is not yet officially diagnosed or identified, but the child does require specially designed instructions. So this goes for a lot of children who, especially in the pre-primary, primary ages, we try not to label the child and give a diagnostic label right there, but recognize that the child has academic challenges and therefore needs, specific tailor-made instruction. So for those children also, the IEP is formulated. So when we look at the history of IEP, where did it come from? And most special ed movements, the bearing of special ed movements started from the United States. And in 1975, the public law 94-142, popularly known as PL 94-142, was passed in the United States. And this law was the first of its kind, which said education for all handicapped children. It envisaged education for all handicapped children. It was operating under the principle that every child is entitled to receive special education appropriate to his or her needs. And in fact, it was the federal or the public funding that was set aside. That's why it was made as a public law. A lot of tenets of this law were formulated. There were 6 major principles guiding this law, and out of which one of them was the IEP. That is the concept of drawing up an individualized educational program for a child based on his or her challenges or needs was introduced. It took birth from the public law. This law talked about, not rejecting any child based on his or her disabilities. It talked about providing that education in a least restrictive environment for the child. It talked about a legal process, because this was a law passed by the government. It had a due legal process to it. So you could take recourse to court and legal process if the IEP was not met, or if when the IEP is being drawn up, and etc. So it had a legal implication, and it ensured parent participation in the whole process. That is a brief history of IEP. In a lot of countries, including in India, it is not a legal document. So the legal part of it is not there, but all the other essences, all the other principles that guided this IEP is usually implemented in almost most countries where the children with special needs are provided services. So why do we have to draw up an IEP? Why is it important? What the IEP does is it creates an opportunity. It brings for teachers, parents, school administrators, or the related services professionals, the students also, to all come onto one platform, one common page, to work together to improve the educational results for the child with special needs. So it is basically having a common ground where all the stakeholders are involved in the process of education for this child. The IEP document is therefore, it is the central focus, or it is the pivot of the educational program planning for special, for children with special needs. And it forms the basis. It forms the foundation for your daily lesson plans or a weekly lesson plannings and your instructional the instruction that classroom instruction basically, where you write out your lesson plans based on what units you're going or what themes you're working on, the materials involved and so on. So the IEP is actually the umbrella document that actually gives birth to that informs and provides the material for your further lesson planning, the using of appropriate resources, using of appropriate support systems, learning support systems, etc. So that is why the IEP is important, because it is the document that actually catapults you into further breaking down the educational goals and implementing them in the classroom. It is a visible record. So it is a paper trail. Basically, it is a paper trail documentation of a commonly agreed decisions by all the concerned stakeholders, or a multidisciplinary team of professionals, parents, students. Sometimes when the children are older, they are also involved in the decision-making process. So this IEP is a visible record. It leaves a good paper documentation about the decisions or the educational programming goals that has been commonly agreed by all the stakeholders. And that therefore they can be reviewed. And usually when you draw up an IEP, there is also a term, like for what duration you are drawing up the IEP. So then you can go back after that duration of time, review it, or in between, if you need to revise it, if something is not working and if you want to revise it in between, you can build in those kind of, clauses into it. So therefore, what it does is, it brings everybody onto one table, onto one same page regarding decision making on the whatever interventions and whatever academic planning has to be made for the child. So there is no confusion. Everybody is on the same page. Everybody knows what's going to happen, and everybody's input is also taken. So it is a very collaborative process. What the IEP does is it includes all the instructions which help create the best possible learning environment for a child with special needs. Therefore, it provides guidelines to inform the teaching staff of what are the different kinds of support they can provide, what are the different kinds of materials they can use. So again, it is giving information in the direction of achieving a certain kind of academic goals with the child. And it because it is all mentioned in black and white, it gives clarity, and it also provides insight into what could be the possible barriers that children may have, children with special needs, with varying disability conditions, with varying skill sets, with varying strengths and challenges. Each child would be different in the way of what they require, to be able to be successful. So writing up an IEP, because it is tailor-made, because it is individualized to that particular child, it gives more clarity about, what are the possible hurdles the child may have, and therefore how can we go about removing those hurdles or best supporting the child to overcome those hurdles in achieving the set goals. So with all this that I've spoken, basically, you can kind of delineate the purpose of an IEP. The primary purpose of an IEP is to set reasonable goals, get an understanding of the child, and then set reasonable learning goals for the child and try and implement it. The second is to state the services that the child requires. So not just the educators, what the teacher is going to do, but also, with keeping in mind the limitations that the child has, or the challenges that the child has. What are the other services, or the other support systems that should be combined with the learning goals, or what the teacher is going to do, so that learning and performance becomes optimal with regard to the child's progress. So the IEP is needed for, we've already talked about two primary needs. It also serves certain other functions, four major functions. One is legal, especially in countries like USA, where it is a legal document. So usually in the IEP team, you will also have a lawyer, a legal person who will be there to monitor this. And, if the IEP is not, if there are problems with the IEP later on, the parent can, actually have recourse to the law. They can sue the team or the therapist or, the school if those, if the goals are not met. So the legal person is, the legal aspect is there. In a lot of countries, as I said earlier, in countries like India, it is not legal, but it is a requirement because all educational institutions use it for instructional purposes, for administrative purposes, as well as for, collaborating with the parents and involving them in the teaching learning process. So when we say administrative, again, if you're working in a school, you have to have certain amount of documentation. You're required to, if you're in a regular school, you have to produce, quarterly plans or term plans, and then you have your weekly lesson plans and so on. So similarly, for the child with special needs, it's narrowing it down to those plans to the particular child in question. So for administrative purposes, to actually have a paper trail track of, what is being planned, what is being implemented, how is it being done, so schools are required to have these kind of documents. So from an administrative point of view, that is used. Third, I think this is the most important one, the instructional point of view. Instructional point of view, it's mainly for the educators to understand, to give them a clear direction on where, what, how, and why they're going to choose certain goals and objectives for this child, and how they're going to implement it so that they can optimize the child's performance. And then last but not the least, the need for parent involvement. So, when you're drawing up the IEP, you can take a lot of information in from the parents. You can use their input on what they think is important for the child to, learn, and so on. So it is, again, not something the educators do without, keeping the parents in the dark. It is involving the parents so that, they know what is happening. They are also contributors to that, because when you draw up these goals, you would also want the parents to carry on some of those activities at home. So it is also to make them equal partners with you in the teaching learning process. So basically, the necessity of this is to just sum up, what IEP is, why is it necessary. From a management point of view, it is to plan and make sure that the services are delivered in the way it should be delivered. It is, helps to serve as a good communication bond between the service providers, the teachers, the educators, or other therapists, and the parents. Accountability. It is a good tool for monitoring and reviewing whether the goals and objectives you've set has been met. If they have been met, then you need to plan further, set up new goals. You can review the progress made by the child. Sometimes it is very possible that, the IEP you've drawn up may not have worked, or may have worked only partially. So, you can review that, and you can, decide, okay, in the next IEP, what are the changes I need to bring about? So, it is making yourself accountable to what you have, to the plan you've drawn up, and to review it and revise it as and when necessary. So the ultimate goal basically is to provide the best possible services to the child and help the child put up, the best performance output as possible. So what are the different components of IEP? What do you think, different the components of IEP need to be? First and foremost, We know children with disabilities have, may have challenges in different areas, not just education. So they may have speech and language issues. They may have motor issues. They may have, psychological or, behavioral conduct or emotional issues and so on. Sometimes they may also have certain medical conditions which may be affecting their academic performance. So sometimes there are even two or more conditions or comorbid conditions that coexist. Therefore, you need to have a multidisciplinary team to be involved in the IEP process. In finally coming out with an IEP, the input from the multidisciplinary team is very, very important. And this team is decided as per the child's needs. If the child has speech and language problems, then obviously the speech and language pathologists need to be involved. The child has motor issues, depends what kind of motor issues. So maybe the physiotherapist, or if not, the occupational therapist may need to be involved. So again, it depends on what the child's needs are. Depending on that, you need the relevant professionals from that discipline to be part of your IEP team, or at least to inform what your IEP, to inform the contents of your IEP. So input from these professionals can be taken. So when you have a multidisciplinary team, obviously you need to have an assessment in those particular areas. So depending on whatever the child's challenges are and needs are, strengths are, a proper assessment profile needs to be drawn up by all the concerned professionals involved in the multidisciplinary team. And all this, the team, the assessment information that they gather, all this finally results in the program planning. So therefore, an IEP, again, I repeat, an IEP is not just an academic, it doesn't just take care of academics. It takes care of all areas that is required of the child. So as I said, you may even have, social skills being taken up. You may even have behavioral skills, especially the behavioral skills which are necessary for the child to function within a classroom situation, being taken up as IEP. So your IEP program planning needs to involve all these areas. And then once you've drawn up the plan, you've written up the IEP, then comes the actual implementation. You actually make it functional in the classroom. And this information that or the IEP document you've drawn up with the help and input from professionals, the multidisciplinary team, the assessment reports, the parents, and so on. And it has culminated into an IEP document. The IEP document then provides you the information on how to go about planning your lessons, which is the actual instruction that takes place in the classroom. So when you're doing lesson planning, obviously you break it down into smaller objectives. You think about what are the different, if the child keep in mind the child's strengths and challenges, and therefore, what modifications or accommodations you may need to make with regard to teaching learning strategies, with regard to study skills, with regard to the materials and resources you're going to use to teach the child. So when it comes to implementation, you take into all this information that you have will be used and utilized to make your lessons more reachable and more inclusive, so that it caters to the differential needs of the child. And then last but not the least, the most important thing, once you've done all that, you've set it, your goals are set for a certain period, you've implemented it through that period, and then it sets the stage for the evaluation. So once you've done all this, you can evaluate the child based on whatever goals you've set up. You can also use curriculum-based assessments to inform those goals. So the goals that you've taken can tie in with the curriculum-based assessment. It can tie in with the anecdotal records. In most schools, I know you need to keep anecdotal records of students, so that work samples, representative work samples in each of those particular area can be added on. So for example, if it's a written expression goal, then you can, give work samples of, where the child was at the beginning, and probably when you're evaluating at the end, you can give a work sample. So that will show you the difference between how much the child has progressed. So it's an actual tangible record of evaluating. And this is also good documentation because you can actually see it. Even in parent-teacher meetings, this is a very good way of, it's not just the test scores or the examination marks or percentages or the grades that they score that is important. Work samples, representative work samples, which show where the child was at the beginning and where the child is now after the implementation of the IEP, can actually help. So these kind of, these 5 components, if your IEP takes care of all these 5 components, then you have drawn up a very good IEP. And that is basically the basis for how you go about doing, implementing and using an IEP to the best extent possible. So what should an IEP have? It is very much similar to what the components that we have talked about. What we talked about earlier, the components is all the different areas that, all the different things that the IEP needs to have. But if you take one particular goal, one particular area, say you're taking the writing area, then it should show where the child is currently functioning. That is called PLOP, or the present level of performance. So if it is a writing goal, I'm just taking the example of writing because, it's the most visible way of a skill and one of the most commonly, lacking skills in children with special. So present level of performance, you'll have to state clearly what the child's level is, where the child is presently at. And then you formulate an annual goal. If the child is here, from here, this is where the child is going to be at the end of the year. So within a year's time, this is your goal. So again, usually we use the academic year, especially in a school setting. So, your annual goal is drawn up. And then your annual goal is further broken into short-term objectives. So annual goal is maybe for the whole academic year. And then you break it up into either the terms or the weeks, depending on the school. Some schools have it on a monthly basis. Some schools have it term-wise. Some schools have it trimester, and so on. So it depends on what time allocation your school demands. According to that, you make up the short-term objectives. And then of course, you implement it. And then it also includes, what are the other related services that the child needs to have. So apart from the goals you're drawing up, the child may need something extra. So for example, if the child has difficulty with behavior, or the child has difficulty with speech and language, apart from the language goals that you're teaching as an educator or you've taken up in the IEP, they may still need additional services from a speech and language therapist, probably in a clinical setting. Or in certain schools, you do have a multidisciplinary team. Or if it is a behavior issue, maybe the school counselor would step in to help out. So, whatever related services are there, that also need to be mentioned. And if the child needs to go to this particular professional, how many times a week, all that is mentioned in the IEP. And then, of course, the evaluation procedures. What is it that you're actually going to, how are you going to evaluate whatever you've drawn up? So when we, the key to writing up an IEP is to start, clearly. So when you have to start clearly, the present levels of performance have to be mentioned in with absolute clarity, so that there's no ambiguity in what you've stated. Any person, if you leave the job and somebody else comes in, or if you're away and somebody else steps in, picking up the present levels of, knowing where the child is at should be clear enough to justify the goal that you have drawn up. So what it does is, it provides complete and accurate information of that particular skill that you're working on. For example, if you're working on writing, what is the present level of performance the child in writing. So, in writing, the child is able to hold a pencil grasp is fine. The child is able to copy, but, the child is not able to, is having difficulties while writing a complete sentence. You can even mention the child is able to write words, but not able to write a sentence on their own. Create and write a sentence, build a sentence. So you've clearly mentioned what the child's present level of performance is, with regard to the writing skill. So whenever you're writing an IEP for a particular skill, the present level of performance need to be very fine-tuned and be very specific so that you know exactly what the child has, what the child's strengths are, and or the known skills are. And from there, you can plan the, what next has to be done. You also have to relate it to other components of the IEP. So writing is not an isolation skill. It is very, very closely related to reading, comprehension, and, these kind of areas. So, you have to correlate it to those areas as well. How is it helping? If the child's reading level is, very close to this writing level. If the child's comprehension level, because all these do, have an effect, have a potential effect on the writing skill. So you have to, they have to be in synchronization. So it cannot be that, you're teaching the child to write a sentence, but the child can hardly even read properly. So, there should be, your writing skill IEP has to be in sync with the other related skills in the IEP. Similarly, even attention for that matter. If the child's attention span is very low, you cannot expect the child to be immediately writing a sentence at that point. So therefore, when you're writing the present level of performance and taking up a particular skill, it has to be in, in sync with concurrent skills that contribute to this particular target writing skill. And it has to be stated clearly, again, I said, with clarity, with specifics onto what are the strengths of the child, as well as what are the challenges or the deficits in the child. It should also be very clear in describing the adverse effects of the disability on the educational performance. So for example, if you're taking up a writing skill, yes, the writing skill is poor in this child, and you have to work on it. But if there are other things, if they say there are things like the child has, ASD, and the child has certain behaviors, certain repetitive movement or rocking movement or those kind of behaviors associated with that condition. Or some children have, sensory issues, for example, or they may have attention issues, or they may have a combination of these. So if there are these kind of specific disability specific areas which is going to affect the writing skill that you're taking up for IEP, then you have to also mention that you're planning this, but there are these issues, so therefore you'll have to plan the present, that also has to be mentioned, so that that even though you're taking this thing up, you have to bear in mind that the child has these issues which will probably be pose obstacles in achieving that goal. And then when you actually write the present levels of performance, use behavioral terms, which can be observed, which can be measured. If you say the child knows how to write words, the word know is again very ambiguous. What does the child know? So, be specific, whether the child can copy the words if you provide a sample, or if dictated, when you sound the words out, the child is able to write the words. So that was your present level of functioning. Okay, child is able to write words, but is unable to write a sentence. So that's what you're planning on. So when you're writing the present level of performance, be very clear and concise. So when you say the child can copy, and you can mention whether the child can copy from a sample given from the board, or from a sample given side by side next to the desk, mention that. So very clearly mention what the child is capable of doing, and that can be easily seen and measured also. When we say measured, it is observable. Some of the things are measurable also. Like, most of the time, say 99 out of 10 times the child is able to copy. Maybe there are occasional days, or say some days the child is disturbed, doesn't do it. But, you can say, okay, at least 80% of the time, or 8 out of 10 times, the child is consistently able to copy words correctly. So your present level of performance need to be very, very clearly mentioned. So in terms, preferably, as I said, in behavioral terms. So use words like copy or trace, independently write, or, things like, able to, especially in math, it is very easy. You can say is able to add single digit numbers using pictures. So be very specific in what the present level of performance is. And all these things that you've mentioned in the present levels of performance should be able to, should provide the basis for justification for why you're taking up certain goals and objectives for instruction purpose. So when you're drawing up, once you've given the present level of performance, you're drawing up the annual goals and short-term objectives. So when you're formulating this, again, certain things should, not just the current performance level, but if the child has been with you or been with the school for earlier, or if you have record of things, of services he or she has attended previously. So the past achievements, gives you an idea about, how the child has progressed. So it gives you an inclination about how much you should plan for. If the child has had a record of, very small progress, then obviously you will tune in. You will, you will modify your goals and short-term objectives accordingly. So the past achievements provide some clue. The current performance level gives you a springboard on from where to start. Student preferences, again, some of the children may have preference for certain items, certain kind of learning, certain learning modalities, or if they're older children, they may like learning certain subjects. So, so for example, if it's an older kid and you're trying to teach them writing, choose a subject which the child is interested in. So if the child is interested in cars, probably you can start their writing goals, use writing about cars. So use student preferences also. Sometimes they may like using, thicker pencils. For example, if the child has, fine motor issues, and they prefer using thicker pencils or pencils with a pencil tip. So given to those, allow those student preferences, which will help you to achieve your goals and objectives better. Think of the practicality. Practicality is certain goals and, certain short-term goals and objectives, annual goals and short-term objectives can be done very much within the classroom. For example, if you're teaching them time, you can have, the teacher-made clocks and student-made clocks, but you can also bring, say, a clock, a real clock that is not working, or even a working clock, and put it up on the classroom wall. It is pretty practical to do that so that the child gets as close, a real life experience of learning how to read time using that. So it is practical in that context. But suppose you're teaching shopping skills, for example. It's not always possible to teach, to take the child to the shop every time you try to teach that skill. Okay, so there you might have to have a simulated situation. So when you're drawing up the annual goals and short-term objectives, keep in mind the practicality of being able to do that, and therefore modify your goals and short-term objectives accordingly. Priority needs. Again, it's not, it should be a collaborative effort, the IEP goals that are drawn up. So think of what is priority. Is it important that the child, if a child does not even have basic self-care skills, like brushing, toileting, and these kind of skills? Is it practical to, dive into higher academic skills then? Or should the priority be more to do with, say, the social skills, the self-care skills, and then, maybe some pre-academic skills, and then move into academic skills? So prioritize There may be lots of needs as per the assessment that is drawn up by the multidisciplinary team. But again, you cannot take up everything at the same time. So you need to prioritize what you need to choose as annual goals and short-term objectives. And then, of course, mention the time allocated. Whether you're planning this, for how long are you planning? Annual goals, of course, is for 1 year. But the short-term objectives, again, mention how much time you're going to give. Also, time allocated can be if the child is, if you're drawing up an IEP for a child who's attending resource room services. The child may not be coming to the resource room all the time. So the child may be coming to you twice a week or thrice a week. So mention, how much time is being spent on the child. So say 3 periods per week or 2 periods of 45 minutes each per week. So when you're drawing the annual goals and short-term objectives, the time allocated is also, has to tie in with whatever objectives you're making up. If you're meeting the child every day, definitely you can, the goals can be slightly more broader. Whereas if the child is just coming to you once a week or twice a week, you may have to limit the amount of, the extent of the goal that you're going to take up. So all these things need to be borne in mind when you're drawing up annual goals and short-term objectives. And then when you're developing the goals and objectives, it should be done for all the areas that require instruction. It should identify specific skills in each of those areas. So you can have, say, motor areas, social communication, reading, writing, math, whatever. But in each of those areas, what are the specific skills you're going to work on? So you can mention, okay, if it's reading, these are the words, or these are the phonetic components I'm going to work on. If it's writing, these are the things that I'm going to work on. So, identify those specific skill areas. And again, these skill areas have to be determined based on the present level of performance. And then the indicators, on the current level of performance will actually help you to, again, modify your goals and objectives. So you may have an annual goal and you may have a short-term objective. And then, after you've implemented that, the next short-term objective, maybe because, based on how the child has progressed, or how the child's, how much assistance the child requires and all that, the rate of progress, etc. All these will indicate what you do, how you can measure up and evaluate it later. So it serves two major purposes. Levels of performance, it helps to provide the goals and objectives that will be developed, and it provides a benchmark for evaluation or determining the progress. Coming to the related services, you all know, we've talked about this, speech pathology and audiology, occupational therapy, behavior management, transportation. Again, especially if the child is coming to school, whether the child is going to use public transportation or, the child is going to use other school bus, for example. All these things have to be, brought into your related services thing. Sometimes even physical infrastructural thing. If the child has physical inabilities, you might even have to think of, where the classroom should be located. The infrastructural kind of services that the child might need. So these kind of things are maybe the use of an elevator, if the child has to move between different floors for different services and so on. So all the different services that the child needs, medical, counseling guidance, recreation, physiotherapy, all these things can be, have to be mentioned, whatever the child needs as per the child's requirements has to be mentioned. So what are the different curriculum areas? Again, as I said, it doesn't limit itself to only academics. It talks about sensory motor, communication skills can be included, social skills, academic, study skills, or a learning strategy skill, especially with the older kids, this is important. Leisure or hobby related skills, life skills, certain skills which may not be very relevant in school, that school environment, but they are important life skills that the child needs to develop. For example, like organizing their workspace and so on. And vocational skills if the child is of that age. So all these different areas, again, depending upon the age of the child, the present level of functioning, the priority needs that is required to be taken up for instruction. All this will dictate what are the different areas you're going to tackle when you're choosing the curriculum areas for IEP development. Not all the children will need all the areas. So again, it is all very individualized based on the child's individual strengths, challenges, and priorities. So coming to, having given you a good background on what is IEP, what are the different kinds of challenges faced by educators while developing an IEP? I would like the participants to contribute to this. I'm sure most of you are working in schools or similar kind of educational settings, and most of you may have had, difficulties or challenges in some form or the other when you're thinking of developing or writing up an IEP. So, please come forth with your experience and, please share it with the team, with us on what are the different kind of challenges that educators face when you plan and develop an IEP.
Lack of cooperation from teachers, like some teachers don't like to cooperate. Neglectful and uncooperative parents. Coming together to develop IEP becomes a challenge. Cooperation from teachers, lack of expertise, lack of structure in the school system, difficult to bring all the stakeholders on board, absenteeism of learners, lack of cooperation from school management, IEP not being followed, unable to express themselves clearly, lack of budget, lack of knowledge in previous level, lack of untrained teachers, skill level to set goals, lack of knowledge and skills, IEP is not followed consistently, parents do not give the correct information, the person who's creating does not have accurate information of how it's created, IEP is not followed, structure planning is missing, lack of parental support, lack of teacher training, lack of awareness, lack of specialists, support from parents in maintaining of IEP, availability of related services is limited, follow-up is lacking, parental attitude, like they've become fussy, some parents may be psychologically disturbed when they are told, no cooperation from caregivers, people around, no consistent format in developing an IEP, lack of resources, a lot of paperwork and extra working hours, lack of trained teachers, time challenge against curriculum goals, parent support is missing, absenteeism from parents, teachers complain that it is too much work, denial of parents, lack of knowledge, doesn't language barriers, acceptance from parents. Yeah, more or less on those lines.
Pretty much, I think, I think almost all of them have gone through one or more of these, challenges. So they have been pretty forthcoming in, in listing out all these challenges. I'll just give a wrap up to this. Most of the challenges, what you've said is, yes, lack of teaching aids, lack of time in developing, implementing it, cooperation from the stakeholders, say the regular teachers or parents and so on, inadequate parental support and involvement. But also, being not identifying the current level of performance of the child, defining the goals clearly and accurately in precise language, lack of resources, as somebody already said, the right kind of teaching materials. So all this do pose challenges, and there are no straightforward answers to this. What we can do is, to overcome these things, think of more effective ways of dealing with it. If nowadays, of course, we have, tech communication through WhatsApp groups and all that. So you can have, a WhatsApp group for a child involving the stakeholders where you communicate equally. You can have parent-teacher conferences, or, you can use a homework diary to, to request for or ask for parental input, or, communicate with the parents basically on how the child is doing or what you would probably want the parents to do at home. Regular teachers, yes, they themselves are a very overburdened lot. So, for them, probably a child with special needs would be the last priority. But having said that, with better teacher education, with the teachers becoming more and more aware that they have to work in inclusive schools, many of the new generation teachers we find are, more accepting of, how to cooperate and how to co-teach or team teach or work as a team with the special educator. A lot of times it's also, how the special educator helps the regular teacher out. You can even make some of those teaching materials that you use for your special ed kids and give it to the regular teacher for use in the regular classroom with all the children, which will help develop a symbiotic relationship between the regular teacher as well as the special ed teacher. So it's not like the special education department and professionals and the child, posing a burden on the regular teacher, but instead also, lightening her load by giving some constructive and positive support. So all these things have to work in tandem if we have to overcome these kind of hurdles. Time is a big factor, but nowadays with a lot of computerization, typing up an IEP is not, especially if you have a clear-cut format. And most schools nowadays do have a certain format, and it's easier to type it in. So it's not very difficult in that time point of view. Yes, cooperation and mindset, attitude, and everybody coming to collaborating together is important. But what is in our hands as educators? The most important thing that's in our hands is how we define the goals, how we understand the child's strengths and challenges, and draw up an IEP that actually reflects what the child needs and is targeted to achieve. So being able to do that, I think, will be half the battle won. At least that is in our hands as an educator. So I'm coming to a sample format. I'm not saying this is a perfect format. What I've tried to do is, basically different schools have different formats. I have looked at several different formats, some that I've personally worked with, some that others I know have worked with. I've kind of pooled, the gist of all that together, and I've come up with this, basically what I've done is I've divided it into part A, B, and C. It doesn't have to be exactly this format. What is important is the information that is there, that needs to be there in some form or the other. It doesn't matter what format you're using. So what I've broadly divided it just for it, understanding's sake, is part A is a brief case summary about the child. And then part B talks about the annual goals and the short-term objectives in that area. And then part C is to make those goals and short-term objectives workable. The child may need certain other learning supports, such as accommodations and modifications. So, to try and put all these things together as one IEP document. So what is part A? You can have a look at the screen. Part A actually says, why is this IEP being developed? So it gives a justification of why it is being developed. Either the child has been diagnosed as having a disability, or the child is not yet formally diagnosed, but needs special education or similar, has certain needs that point to the child requiring accommodations and modifications or specialized instruction. So this is why I said the child need not always have a set diagnosis. Even before the child can be formally diagnosed, you can still drop an IEP based on the fact that the child has challenges, and therefore those challenges need to be circumvented or remediated. And particularly so, especially in the case of children, with learning disability, specific learning disorder. In India, for example, until 8 years, you cannot formally diagnose. It's a government stipulation that you cannot formally diagnose a child with specific learning disorder, at least until the age of 8 or at least until grade 3. So, but that doesn't mean that you cannot plan for a child and, implement educational goals for that child. So therefore, that is why the reason for developing this IP, I've given these two options. The child requires it because of the disability, or the child requires it because not necessarily because of a disability, but because the child is in need of those kind of accommodations and individualized planning. So this to a brief bio profile of the child is given: name, date of birth, age, and all those with school. What is the exceptionality or the disability that is being identified? Where it's the placement of the child. So is it, again, placement differs. So for some children, it may be in a special school. For some, it may be mainstream school only. For some, it may be mainstream as well as resource room setting. So it depends on what kind of placement the child is in and where the IEP is going to be implemented. Mention the placement. Areas of strengths. So if you read through that, you can, I'm not reading for each and every one. The areas of strengths are given. So that kind of gives you an idea about what the child is capable of. And then what you have is a brief summary of the assessment, the multidisciplinary assessment that has taken place. So the special education, when it was done and what are their findings. Psychological assessment, when it was done, what are their findings. Same with speech. And for this particular child, this is a hypothetical child I've given. The speech and language, goals are, the assessment is also given. And then if there are any other related services that are necessary for the child. So that is also mentioned, like, speech and language therapy, apart from what is going to be done in school, occupational therapy, positive behavior support. So some of these things have been mentioned. Some of, a brief summary of, where the child's, some of the brief areas where the child may actually need intervention. So, those kind of areas have been mentioned, which says, fine motor coordination, attention, receptive and expressive language, and reading, writing difficulties. And even in reading and writing, they have mentioned what exactly, a brief of what is needed. So the IP actually need to cover skills indicated in all these priority areas. So basically, they've drawn out priority areas where IP goals need to be mentioned. And it does also mention that when is this going to happen? So the IP needs to cover skills in all of these areas, and it needs to apply not only to the academic, but also to the co-curricular. That is even the extra, the PE, music, all these co-curricular activities, art and craft, everywhere, all these priority areas need to be looked into and implemented. Resource room services, when will it be provided? So, 5 sessions a week in place of language 2 and 3 and the library. So for this particular child, it is obvious language 2 and 3 have been dropped because of the reading, writing, and language difficulties. So therefore, the second and third language periods, as well as the library period that is allotted for the class, during these periods, the child will attend the resource room services for additional remediation. So that is a brief profile of, of the child, part A. IP part B involves, going into the skills. So here I've given an example of, which academic year, who are the teachers involved. Normally, I just put regular teacher, special teacher here. Normally, the name of the teacher is mentioned, the regular teacher and the special educator, or if it's a behavioral goal, it might be the regular teacher, the counselor, the school, the behavior therapist, and the special educator. So it depends on who are in charge of those goals. So their names are usually mentioned. And then the present level of performance. So here I've given an example of an English academic area, what the present level of performance is. So what are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? The strengths have been mentioned. The child is aware of alphabet phonics. So in phonics itself, I've mentioned alphabet phonics, the child is able to, is aware. he or she is able to decode the CVC words. That's the consonant, vowel, consonant, three-letter words. Read sight words at KG level. So again, very clearly mentioned. So according to the whatever school the child is going, the KG level sight words, in that curriculum, the child is able to do. Make sentences orally with some errors. So that, at least oral sentences, the child is able to do. And where the difficulties are. So the strengths are there and the difficulties are grade level words the child is not able to decode. So there is a starting point, but not at grade level. Grade level sight words, the poor grade level vocabulary. So even though the child is able to construct sentences orally, the vocabulary is not as rich as as the grade level. So maybe the child is constructing very simple sentences orally with very basic words. Difficulty with grade level comprehension and difficulty in sentence writing, not aware of punctuation and capitalization. So this very specifically we've mentioned in English, with regard to reading and writing, where the child is at and where the difficulties lie. So that helps you to, it gives you information on what are the annual goals you have to formulate. So the annual goals will be the child will be able to read sight words at grade 1 to 2 level. So the child is at KG level. So we are moving from KG to 1 to 2 level. So it may not reach 2, but at least at grade to 1 to 2 levels, we are planning for that. Phonics, CVC is already there. So we go to the next level, that is CVCV words and CVBC words, that is 4-letter words using phonics. And the child, we are going to introduce blends, digraphs, and diphthongs along with these phonic elements. So, when we are doing this itself, we are going to bring in these elements into it. Spelling words will be taken up in reading. So with whatever phonics and sight words you're doing, use the same words for spelling. Syllabifications, when you're reading, using the phonetic decoding skills, using, breaking up the word into syllables while you're reading. Sentence construction, so improve the sentence construction along with the vocabulary development. And then writing and grammar skills at 1 to 2 level. And all this is with 55% accuracy. When we say 55% accuracy, it's almost like, out of 10 times, about at least 5 times the child will be able to do, or it can also relate to, if you're grading it, at least 55% grade the child is going to get. The child is going to achieve 55%, marks. And because a lot of schools are very much into grading and marking and, quantifying. So if the child gets at least 55%, then you consider, okay, the child has learned fairly well. So again, you set the criteria, about either you set the criteria as a percentage, or you can say like, 8 out of 10 times, which means 80% accuracy. So, you give that kind of accuracy level also, because that sets your criteria for the goals. And it is also, you have stated in clear terms what exactly you're planning. And then you can break it up into small term objects. So a sample for the first term is given, and the duration of the first term is mentioned from June to September. In reading and comprehension, there's phonics and these words that is going to be taken up. Sight words, 1 to 150 words on the Dole sight word list. So you have the list. Out of that, the first 1 to 150 words. Reading comprehension, it will be multiple choice questions from stories which will use the above mentioned words. So stories which will use the same phonics and sight word elements. From those stories, if you give multiple choice comprehension questions, the child will be able to answer. Grammar and writing, identify that when you give a group of words, what are correct sentences, what are not correct sentences, understand which are statements and which are questions. Write a sentence with correct punctuation and capitalization, at least the capital letter and the full stop or the question mark, since you're mentioning statements and questions. Spelling rules, spelling words using phonics sight words which have been taught in the above in reading. So the words that you've introduced, being able to spell those words. So you've tied your objectives into this element. You notice you haven't yet brought in blends, diagram, diphthongs as yet. Okay, so because this is a short-term object. So you've broken the annual goal into a short-term objective. The methods and materials have been mentioned. I haven't given it a huge thing on the methodology because some indications are given like verbal and non-verbal reasoning, skill-specific worksheets, etc. Because sometimes it's not possible, it becomes too cumbersome to write entire methodology. That can come into your lesson plans. What you can do is you can add worksheet samples, especially worksheets or activities that you're using. You can have a model or a sample included so that, or a picture of that included. And because nowadays we do it by computer, you can, have images of those so that, it is clear that what are the materials you're going to use, how you're going to do it. Evaluation, how are you going to finally see whether the child has achieved this? From the classwork exercises, the child has done the homework, tests. They could be not just oral, they could be a combination of oral, paper, pencil, as well as performance tests. Work samples, from the classwork, homework, work samples, which represent how the child has been progressing. So this gives you a clear idea about how to draw up an IEP. Similarly, I've also given one for the math, where it just mentions what are the strengths in the present level of performance. In the strengths, the child is able to read and write numbers 1 through 100, is able to solve single-digit addition and subtraction problems. The difficulty areas are place value of tens and ones, so that the child is not able to do. So the annual goals, so clearly you've stated where the child stands. The goals are the child will be able to read and write numbers from 100 to 999. That's an annual goal. Place value of tens, ones, and hundreds. Solve two-digit addition, subtraction with and without regrouping. Skip counting by twos, fives, tens, and recite multiplication tables of 1, 2, 5, and 10 with 70% accuracy. So again, you've set an annual goal and then you further break it down into your term goals. So the first term goal is read and write numbers from 100 to 500, 100 to 500. Denote place value of these numbers. So you're teaching the numbers and you're using those itself for teaching place value. Solve two-digit addition problems with and without regrouping. So initially you have not brought in subtraction. It is solving two-digit addition problems. And then skip counting by twos, fives, tens. So the annual goal has been further broken down into a term one plan. And then again, methodology and materials, skill-specific worksheets. So if you have skill-specific worksheets, include images or the actual worksheets as, part of you can include that as part of IEP. These are the ones that you're going to use. Based and blocks, because you're teaching, place value. So based and blocks or place value match. These are the kind of teaching materials you would require. Counters, if the child requires counters or number lines. 1 to 100 grid chart, if the child has to learn skip counting and so on. So basically, what are the materials that you're going to use? Methodology, again, as I said, it can come as part of your lesson planning. It doesn't necessarily have to be brought into detail here. Evaluation, and again, in how you're going to evaluate this. Again, here I've mentioned classwork, homework, all kinds of, tests and assessments. It could be oral, paper, pencil, performance, even, working it out on the board. Sometimes you put problems on the board, ask the children to come up and work. Even that can be taken as a sample, as an assessment, performance assessment. And different work samples. So you can include different kinds of, worksheets or, where the child has done this to prove, how the child has progressed. So initially, maybe if you give 10 problems, the child has got maybe 2 right. But as the child has, moved on and as you've reinforced the teaching through multimodality and all kinds of with different materials, with different activities, you'll find by the end of the term, the accuracy has gone up. So from 2 out of 10, probably the child has moved on to 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10. So again, all this will help you in evaluating. In some schools, I have seen, the methodology is also mentioned in detail along with the IEP itself. Whereas in some schools, the methodology is kept more as a lesson planning. For every lesson, when you do the lesson planning, there the methodology is explained in detail. So again, it's what works, what is stipulated by the organization or the school that you work in. That's important. Basically, what happens is what is all the information that is required for an IEP is being put here. Part C is accommodations and modifications. There's a wide list of these. In some of my earlier workshops and webinars also, we've talked about the different learning support systems. A wide range of accommodations and modifications, broadly in 6 different areas. One is general language use, academic area, the behavioral area, tests and assessments, and the grading area. So all these areas, different kinds are suggested by the different boards, CBSE and iOS, whichever boards you're following. So based on that, on those, you can choose whichever accommodations and modifications are required for this particular child. So normally what we do is we have a accommodation and modification list, and then we tick off which is necessary for this particular child. That is done. So usually that is done. And one thing after evaluation, normally in a regular, especially if it's a resource room setting or a regular school, I give one more comment box where, after the annual goal is reviewed, you have a comment box on whether the child needs to continue services, if there are any other anecdotal records that you need to put through. All these things can be put through to justify whether the child needs to continue services, or whether there are other areas that need, to be looked into for the following year, whether the placement of the child needs to be reviewed, etc. So, you can add on. So I think this gives you a good idea about what IEP is, what it should have, so that you have a fair amount of information on what the child is, what the child's strengths, weaknesses are, what needs to be planned, how it needs to be planned, how it needs to be implemented, how it needs to be evaluated, and then the cycle goes on again. So you plan, once you evaluate, you plan again. So it's a never-ending cycle until the child achieves that particular area. Then, of course, then there will be other areas to be taken up.
Now, without further ado, we would move on to the question answer round. Are you ready for the first question, Geetha ma'am?
Yes, please go ahead.
So moving on to the first question, it is by So, who wants to know who is qualified to design an IEP and how long is the duration for a short-term goal in an IEP?
When we say it's an educational program, like IEP means individualized education program. So usually it's a special educator. Okay, but you can also have, because not always schools have special educators. Sometimes what happens is a school counselor is the one who is actually providing those services. So it depends on what goals you're formulating. In some places, in some schools, you may have a counselor as well as a special educator. So it depends on what goal. So maybe the school counselor is taking part of the behavioral aspects of it, whereas the special educator is looking at more of the reading, writing, math part. So it depends on who is involved, who is responsible. If you notice if you recollect in the part A of the IEP format that I showed, the person's responsible, the teacher's responsible have been mentioned. So if it's a regular teacher and a special educator, the special educator is the one who usually draws up the IEP, but both in collaboration with the regular ed person, and then they both are responsible because it has to be implemented. if it is say a behavioral thing, maybe you will have a counselor as well as, or a psychologist as well as a special educator. If it's purely very specific special education goals, then probably it's just you. Sometimes it will be just you as an educator planning these motor skills or communication skills, but the child may be getting additional services from the speech and language therapist or the OT and whatever. So in that case, the goals will be drawn up by the educator in terms of what is possible in the educational setting. So it may not be a clinical setting kind of goal with a speech and language person is good, but you bring it down to the educational setting and what is relevant there.
Thank you so much.
Sometimes it can be one person, sometimes it can be more than that.
It's a multidisciplinary team, or the one who is working one-on-one with the child could also be designing the IEP. The next question is by Mrs. Aarti Kothari. She wants to understand, is it a prerequisite to diagnose the child's condition before setting up the intervention plan? If there are multiple factors that are playing a role and there's no particular diagnosis, how can we work ahead with the child?
Again, I go back to the part A, part of the IEP that I said, the purpose of the IEP. Why is the IEP being drawn up? The part A that I showed, it had two clear parts, like the child has an exceptional need or a disability. So that means that there is an actual diagnosis. There was also another column that not identified as a disability, but has specific needs or challenges which require specialized instruction, including accommodations. So if you have an IEP which has these two options, you can easily use it for whichever child, whether they have an established diagnosis or not. IEP can still be used. See, this is why I said it is not a legal document in many countries, including in India. So here we are taking it more as an instructional or an educational kind of program planning, implementation, and evaluative process. So that is why it is more to do with we are not interested always in having to diagnose the disability. Sometimes parents refuse to go for a formal evaluation, but then by law the child is entitled to be in the classroom. So what do you do then? You have to still plan for the child. So then you have to do an informal assessment at least and find out where the child stands with regard to that particular skill. Say if it is reading or writing or math or behavior or whatever, where the child stands there, and plan accordingly. So it is not always necessary to have a specific diagnosis. If the child is lagging behind and needs support, then yes, IEP can be drawn up. And nowadays, that's why a lot of schools, they don't necessarily call it special education. They call it learning support program or Department of Supportive Education. These are the kind of terminology that is being used now, because it kind of includes it is under the premise that not all children will be diagnosed. They may just be referred by the regular teacher, for example, because the child is simply not catching up. And they may be going into an IEP for getting supportive education.
Thank you for the answer for this, ma'am. The next question is by Michelle Domingo, who wants to understand from you that is it fine to set another goal for children with special needs when the previous one has not been met or achieved?
It depends on what goals you're, see, if you have, say, 5 or 6 goals in different areas, it may not be that none of them have been met. Okay, maybe the child has met the reading goal. Maybe the child has met the, the behavioral goal. But maybe the writing goal has not been fully met. Or maybe the child is still in the process of, moving towards that goal, but has not achieved it completely. So it depends on whether none of the good, that rarely happens. It hardly ever happens unless there's a real, a medical condition, or the child has been away and missed, lots of sessions and schooling. In those cases, yes, the child may not have achieved anything, which is when, when you're doing the evaluation, you mention why. If there has been, long absences, or if there's been health conditions, or the child has had maybe maybe the related supportive services, were discontinued. There may be reasons. So if you can, as long as you can pinpoint it, these were the reasons, and therefore the child did not achieve the goals, then you can, keep going. But again, as I said, if you've drawn out 5 goals or 8 goals for the child, at least some of them will be met. Or if they have not met anything and the child has shown no progress, then somewhere your planning has gone wrong. So it's halfway through itself, if you find it's making no sense and the child is not making any progress, that's when you need to rethink, review, and see whether you need to alter your goals or your short-term objectives.
Effective planning while doing the goals, knowing the present level of performance of the child, will definitely go a long way to help you set clear objectives that will not make you have to repeat or change the goals in the process. The next question is by Raquel, who wants to know how to implement IEP effectively in a school setup when there are many students with learning challenges whom we as a special educator have to cater to.
This is a very, very practical question, and having worked in schools myself, both in inclusive resource room settings, all this, personally, what I would say is I prefer if the IEP document is kept to a minimum. The more information you try to put in and make it a bulky document, teachers actually spend a whole amount of time on writing up the document rather than, implementing it effectively with the children. So it is, I think the schools need to come up with, a very user-friendly and more time, not so time-consuming format where the basics are there, or, and the information is there, but then the rest can be mentioned in your lesson plan. The lesson plans anyway teachers have to do. You have to write the lesson plans and what you're going to do. So that's fine. And, you can mention, actually what I used to do was I used to have a very one-page format where I used to list out the annual goals in each area, just list it out basically. And then at the end of the term, or whenever the evaluation is happening, I would just evaluate, and I would just add work samples or curriculum-based assessments, and then give in the comment box, mention whether the child has achieved the goal or not, whether what the next goal should be, or if it's after one academic year, what recommendations are mentioned for the next academic year. It helps, like the modifications and accommodations list that I showed. It helps if there is a list, at the back, and you just have to tick off. So I think school administrative departments, especially the Department of Special Education, need to get input from teachers and think about how to come up with, a format which is not very time consuming, but at the same time will have quite a bit of information. So I think that is, and each school has its own way of functioning. I am a person for very minimal kind of time spent on documentation. I'm not saying documentation and paper trail is not important. It is, but spending too much time on that and effectively taking time away from planning for the lesson or the activities, or preparing learning materials, which will be of use to the child in the learning situation. I think more time needs to be spent on that rather than, on writing up a document. So it is how you balance the two that matters. And it is for every school, every management, every department which works in this area to come up with a workable format, which will help balance both.
Thank you for this insight, ma'am, and helping us as professionals to know that balance is important between paperwork and also how you work with children with different teaching learning materials. Now we have the question by Chetali. She wants to understand how to make or motivate the teachers to follow or implement the IEP on a daily basis or a regular time.
Special educators, if you're talking about special educators, well, that's their job, isn't it? So you have to do it. There's no other go. If you're talking about regular teachers and how they can partner with you in implementing it, as I said, regular teachers are already, I mean, if you're dealing with this many kids, the regular teachers probably dealing with many more number of kids and diversities in their classroom. So what you need to do is, explain to them this is what the child needs. You can give them, sometimes teachers are not aware what they can do. So, give them, make them aware of, what you try out with the child and how the child responds and how the child takes it on easily. And if you can share some of those insights with the teachers, that itself helps. Sometimes if you're if you're a special educator who's going into the classroom, I worked in that situation actually when I was not just a resource room educator, but I was also an inclusion specialist. So when I go in, I don't just, yes, my target is the child who is, who I am implementing the IEP for, but I also help that teacher in co-teaching. So sometimes when it's a very difficult part of the lesson, I would tell the regular teacher that I'll do the teaching and you can, kind of assist me. So I would have gone armed with all the, because my kids are the ones who have the challenges. I would have made those kind of appropriate teaching materials and everything. So I put it out, and it's not just used for my target kids, but it's used for the whole class. So then it is, the regular teacher is benefiting. Her regular students are also benefiting from that. So when there's that kind of a symbiotic work relationship, then it really works. Some teachers may still not like you to venture into their territory, but with awareness and as I said, more and more new generation teachers who are more open to the idea of inclusion, who are more used to seeing children with diversities in their classroom, they are more open to these kind of co-teaching, team teaching kind of arrangements. So remember, it has to be both ways. The regular teacher has to be helped in some ways at least. For example, I was talking about the math skill, addition and subtraction. Now, something as simple as the teacher may be teaching using fingers, in the classroom, whereas the child you have is not able to use fingers. So the child may need either a 100 grid chart or a number line. Sometimes I've given as simple a thing as a number line to a regular teacher, and I told her, when my child has to do these things, have this number, give the child the number line, or allow, at least I would have given the child the number line, allow the child to add using the number line. So the child will pick it, take it out of its bag and, start using it. So even that much, goes a long way in, helping you reach your goals and targets. So there are simple ways in which this can be done. You can also, give them list of activities that can be done so that they also reach out to multifarious, diverse learners, not just the ones who are under your IEP. Even in the so-called regular population, there's so much of diversity. So make it fun, interesting. A special educator can contribute a lot. I'm not saying you can win over all regular teachers, but there's a lot of them that you can win over if you have a collaborative team kind of a relationship. It's something you build over the years.
Actually, equipping the teachers with supportive strategies will definitely help them to collaborate with you, and it can go a long way in gaining support from them. The next question is from, go ahead.
So also, peer buddies. We don't, if you even tell the teachers that some of your brighter students, so your more able students, can be used as peer buddies and how to use them. Even giving them ideas on how to use a peer buddy system will not only lessen the load on the regular teacher, but also, create such a good positive environment between the child who has challenges and his or her peers. So all these kind of different strategies, even sending in some materials and resources which will help. Or if the child, I have done things like where a regular teacher, already gives me what are the lessons she's planning for her regular class. And I have made with my children in mind, I've made certain materials, or I've collected some songs or some activities based on it, and I send it to her so that she can use it not just for my kids, she can use it with her whole classroom. So that is what builds a kind of, as I said, it's a give and take. If you just want the regular teacher to wake up one day and understand, no, you have to provide for these children, no, they won't, because they already have enough of their hands full with their children. So, and it comes with time. It comes with, with more and more teacher training happening, not much with, more with regular teachers actually, on how they can become more and more inclusive and how they can implement more and more inclusive practices in the classroom. When you have teachers who are tuned in for that, it's very easy to implement IEPs for them.
Rightly put forth. When you suggest strategies that teachers can implement, they also feel that their workload is being shared. So building a rapport with them, coming up with strategies will definitely be helpful.
You can also provide multiple materials. That, like I said, I gave number line to one child who's under me. But then after a few sessions, when I went to that classroom, the teacher was saying, some other children who are weak in math, they too need the number line. So I made some extra number lines and took it to her and gave it to her. She was thrilled that her other kids were doing it. So you see how much it affects, all you did was provide some 2 or 3 extra number lines, and her other children were prospering. Those parents would be affected. So there's so much of positivity that can spread when it is a collaborative relationship.
Very true. Moving on to the next question, it's by Jacob Adelkun. Is it ideal for a special educator to plan IEP alone with the presence of other professionals?
I didn't quite get that question. Can you repeat it, please?
Yeah, so this is by Jacob, who wants to know, is it ideal for a special educator to plan the IEP alone without the presence of other professionals?
Without,
yes, sorry.
Ideally, they say no. And again, as I said, because of time constraint, because of not being able to get all the, the concerned multidisciplinary professionals on board, that this is why we ask for, input from them. So if at least you can't sit on the same table at the same time for a collaborative meeting, at least talk with them, or at least, gather, ask the parents to go and, provide information on what they're doing, that most professionals are willing to give. So if the child is attending, say, an OT, OT, a person's therapy sessions outside of school, or even within the school in their department, try and get in touch with them, or at least try to get some kind of a write-up about what they're doing, and, for what skills they are targeting, what are the different activities they're doing in the therapeutic setting. So at least if you have that much information, that will inform you to write the IEP. You may not be able to physically sit with them at one table and do it, which I think, yes, it's very, very difficult getting all different professionals on board and all that. So at least if you can get, a written thing on what is it that they're working on, when you're planning your educational goals, you can try and incorporate those, those objectives within your activities. You may not even, sometimes say if the child has fine motor issues, and the OT may be working on hand exercises, but then you're going to work on writing. So, you can probably consult the OT and ask, okay, then with regard to writing, what are the things you may suggest would help the child? So probably the OT will be able to give you information on, the child can use a particular kind of pencil or a particular kind of pencil grip on the pencil so that it helps the child to write better. So getting their input is what is important. It's not necessary that they have to sit at the same table always, but if there are related professionals who are involved with the child, it's always better to get all that information. It will help you to plan better. Because then when you plan activities, you can include fine motor activities as well, or do those accommodations as well.
He's being informed as to what the other professionals are doing will help you to plan better for supporting the child with special needs. We'll take the last question for today, ma'am. It is by Varda Zamindar. Wants to understand in the part A of the IEP, who does the psychological assessment? Can that assessment be done by the special educator? How long does it take if the special educator is to do that assessment?
Normally, psychological assessment is done by psychologists, or the school counselor is usually a trained psychologist. So, usually they do that. Generally, educators don't do psychological assessments, but having, because there are certain legal implications. There's no hard and fast rule that you cannot do it, but you cannot put your signature on it. It is official. It's only a trained psychologist who can certify and put their signature on an assessment report of psychological evaluation. But there are certain rating scales and such things which even sometimes village level community workers can be trained in. Very simple ones which give you information about behavior and these kind of identifying skills and weaknesses and these kind of things. So it depends on whenever you choose an assessment, see what the assessment is, whether it's a formal tool. If it's a formal tool, then it will have specifications on whether a trained person in that area has to do it or not. But if it can be used by anybody, then probably even the special educator can use it. So it depends on what tool you're going to use.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for throwing light on who does the psychological assessment. And thank you for patiently answering the queries from our participants. I would also take this opportunity to thank the participants for being so patient throughout the session and for your active participation as well.